Good evening, everyone. I'm Professor Barlo Dermagrdician of the Armenian Studies program. I'd like to welcome you to this evening's presentation. This evening's presentation is actually the final event in our spring lecture series of the Armenian Studies program. And this academic year, which began in fall of 2020, beginning in August of 2020, from August of 2020 to this evening, we have had 23 different events, including lectures, film showings, conferences. So thank you for all of you for supporting our efforts in this very challenging year to follow us and to join us on Zoom. After tonight's presentation by Dr. Sanjian, you will have the opportunity to ask him questions using, once again, the chat function, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. If you're having trouble finding it or need to ask a question, we're going to ask you again to use the chat function. Everyone will be on mute and the cameras will be off during the presentation. I'd like to introduce our guest speaker this evening. Dr. Ara Sanjian is Associate Professor of History and the Director of the Armenian Research Center at the University of Michigan in Dearborn. From 1991 to 1994, he completed his doctoral degree in Modern History of the Middle East at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. And from 1996 to 2005, he was the chairman of the Department of Armenian Studies, History and Political Science at HAKOBIAN University in Beirut. And actually in fall of 2003, he was the Kazan visiting professor at Fresno State, and then later joined the University of Michigan Dearborn faculty in January of 2006. And his research interests span a variety of interests, including post-World War I history of Armenia, Turkey, and the Arab states. He is the author of several monographs, articles, book chapters, and various publications. So we're very happy to have Dr. Sanjian join us today for our final presentation in the spring lecture series. The title of his talk this evening is particularly timely. It is the Armenian Church in Nagorno-Karabagh, Artsakh in Modern Times, and he will be talking to us about the structures and activities of the Armenian Church in the modern period on the territory of Nagorno-Karabagh. And in doing so, I'm sure that many of you will have questions and you will be able to once again ask those at the end of tonight's presentation. So I'd like to introduce our guest speaker for this evening, Dr. Ara Sanjian. Welcome, Dr. Sanjian.
Oh, thank you very much, Barlo. And it's a very kind of friendly audience that I'm used to talk to ever since 2003, the Fresno people. But for the first time, I think it will be online. Previously, I'd always been at the Peters Hall, where you hold your regular events. And let me just share the screen. Okay, today's lecture is part of an ongoing, book-length project that I've been working on and off for something like 20 years, and I've had the opportunity to talk about this at earlier stages of my research. So there will be a few new things and something that I've said before, but I'll basically try to concentrate on the history of the Armenian Church as an institution until roughly around the year 1989, 1990 during my lecture. But of course, feel free to ask me questions more about the later period when I'm ready to answer that. I've done research on that as well, but I just wanted to have this lecture focused and not too shallow. That's why probably in my 40 minutes or so, I will concentrate on the earlier period, which is less known. But I'm ready to, as I said, to entertain questions on the later periods, including up to and after the recent war a few months ago. So as I said, the focus is the Armenian Church as an institution, the Hayastanites Arakelagani Yegeretsi that we're going to talk about. By the way, in Artsakh today, there is also a presence for the Armenian Evangelical Church as well, but they will be outside the focus of our lecture in general. So we cannot say that the church has 100% monopoly of Christian activity in Nagorno-Karabagh these days. Now we have to start with a few words that have been used, and sometimes they have used interchangeably, but we have to be very careful about what we're talking. The name Artsakh. This name, of course, is a historical Armenian name. Artsakh was one of the 15 provinces of historic Armenia. It's mentioned and described in the early medieval Armenian geography, a book which we think was compiled sometime between the 5th and 7th century CE. And we think that the territory of Artsakh, as described in Ashkharat or geography, was about 11,000 square kilometers, which is roughly about 4,400 square miles. So it was a much bigger area than the area of Nagorno-Karabagh. Many scholars believe that, there are antecedents to the name of Artsakh in the Urartian inscriptions, where we come across two place names like Ardakh, Urdeche, Atakhuni, etc., and also in an earlier geography book by the famous Greek geographer Strabo, who wrote in the beginning of the 1st century CE, and he also mentions a place name called Orkistene. But in any case, at least from the 4th century, from the 5th century, in medieval Armenian literature, the name Artsakh is used, of course, very frequently. What about the name Karabagh? Well, Karabagh, of course, is slightly different from Artsakh. It's a much later toponym, and we know that it has been mentioned in various sources starting in the 13th and the 14th century. It is also mentioned by its Armenian translation, Sev Aiki, in the book, in the works of at least one of the Armenian medieval authors at the time. Now, the area of Karabagh has changed over the period. So at different times, it actually meant different geographical boundaries. Under the Safavid and later Persian empires, from the 16th century, first it was a province. There was a province named Karabagh in the Iranian Empire or the Persian Empire. Then, of course, in 1747, a semi-independent Khanate was established, again under some kind of Iranian suzerainty, and that Khanate continued until 1822. In 1806, the Russians conquered Karabagh during their, advance southward. They kept the Khanate for a few years and then abolished it. And after that, the region of Karabagh has successively been part of various administrative, provinces of the Russian Empire in the South Caucasus. Initially, it was part of the Caspian province until 1845. Then there was a redrawing of boundaries, and Karabagh found itself in the Shemacha province. And then the Shemacha province was itself divided into a number of territorial subdivisions, and Karabagh became part of the Elizavetpol province. Elizavetpol is the name the Russians gave to the medieval city of Ganzak, as the Armenians called it, or the city of Ganje, which is now the second largest city in Azerbaijan. At the time of the Russians, it was known as Elizavetpol, the city of Elizabeth, named after one of the queens of the Russian Empire. And this is the map that you see, and this was very important, of course, in the 1910s and 1920s, when the modern boundaries of Soviet Armenia and Soviet Azerbaijan were negotiated and later on imposed by the Bolsheviks. But we're not going to talk over that a lot during our lecture this evening. Under the Soviet regime, very briefly, between 1929 and 1930, there was an okrug, a region of Soviet Azerbaijan called Karabagh, which was larger than Nagorno-Karabagh that we're going to talk about later on. In addition to the territory of Nagorno-Karabagh, it also included the regions of Aghdam, Jebrail, and Kurdistan. And Kurdistan is the modern-day Lachin, Kelbajar region. And its total area was 16,500 square kilometers or 6,400 square miles. So it's, again, much bigger than Nagorno-Karabagh. And at that time, Muslims constitute the majority of the population in the lowland sections of Karabagh, while Armenians predominated in the highlands of Karabagh, where the autonomous region of Nagorno-Karabagh emerged. Now, we have to be very careful, especially after the end of the last war. Azerbaijanis are now trying not to use the word Nagorno-Karabagh at all and are concentrating on the word Karabagh. And for them, there's a tactical, because Karabakh is a much larger place where, yes, the number of Azerbaijanis was much more than the Armenians. But Nagorno-Karabakh was a special because within Karabakh, it was those areas of Karabakh where the Armenians predominated, and it is for them that the autonomous region was created by the Soviet government. So nowadays they want to just basically do away with that idea of having Armenian autonomy, so they are resenting the use of the word Nagorno-Karabakh. In my case, of course, I will be using the word Nagorno-Karabakh simply for the region which has been administered from its center, Stepanakert, as its boundaries have shifted over the years. As an autonomous unit within Soviet Azerbaijan, Nagorno-Karabakh was established in 1923. It formally survived until 1991, when it declared its independence from Azerbaijan, while the Azerbaijanis on their own maps abolished this region altogether. And for them, it does not exist anymore, at least from their own perspective. As I said, Nagorno-Karabakh was an autonomous region. It roughly had an area of 4,400 square kilometers, 1,700 square miles, much smaller than either Artsakh medievally or the region of Karabakh. In 1926, when the first census was taken in Karabakh, its population was almost 90% Armenian and almost 10% Azerbaijani. In Soviet years, of course, the percentage of the Azerbaijani slightly increased, while the percentage of the Armenians slightly decreased, but still the Armenians continued to be the overwhelming majority in the region up until the beginning of the Karabakh conflict in 1988. We start with the Church of AMARAS, and this is, of course, an important landmark in Nagorno-Karabakh. Armenia, and of course Artsakh was part of Armenia at the time, became a Christian state in the 4th century CE, and that's where we're going to start briefly our history. The Church of Amaras is significant because it is reputedly the oldest surviving Christian place of worship in Nagorno-Karabakh, and according to Armenian medieval tradition, this church was founded by Saint Gregory the Illuminator, who was basically the founder of the Armenian Christian church, if we can say, and the first Catholicos of the Armenian church in the early 4th century. And when we talk about the history of Artsakh, and because it's one of the provinces like Udik bordering, the river Kur, and beyond which, of course, the Kingdom of Albania, to some extent, its history is interrelated with the Kingdom of Albania. This Caucasian Albania, which Armenians called AGHUANK, has nothing to do with Albania in the Balkans. And the names are basically, as far as we know, just a coincidence. And on this map, you will see how, for example, Armenia, it's a German map here, Albania, and of course, Iberian or Georgia were roughly visualized to be around 300 CE. This is, of course, around the time when first Armenia, and then very quickly after that, Georgia and Albania became Christian states. Albania as a separate political entity is mentioned from the 2nd and the 1st centuries BCE. And most of what we know about the Albanians either come initially from Greek and Roman classical sources, and after the 5th century, predominantly from Armenian language sources. Of course, Arabic language sources and Georgian language sources do also tell us a few things about Albania, but Armenian sources predominate. And unlike the Armenians and Georgians, who have a very long tradition of written literature going back roughly to the same time, which is the 5th century CE, etc., we have very, very little from Albanian written literature, and that creates problems on how to study their own history. For example, until now, we don't know what the Albanians called themselves, and also we're not even sure whether the word Albania was a geographical entity, and inside it there were many different tribe-like ethnic groups, or something more solid, etc. Again, mostly because we do not have enough written source material from those periods for us to be able to make a clear judgment on this issue. Ancient Armenians called the region AGHUANK, and because in classical Armenian the suffix K has a double meaning of, people as as a plural noun, and also a place. That's why AGHUANK can mean either the Albanians, or it can also mean the land of the Albanians, in the same way as Haik used to mean both Armenia and also used to mean the Armenians as a group. Now, we, in recent decades, the last couple of decades, basically, a few Albanian manuscripts have finally been discovered. They have been deciphered, and the scholars who have studied it say that it is clearly related to modern Udi, which is a language spoken by the very tiny Udi population, and especially to the Udi spoken in the village of Nij, which is one of the most important centers of Udi life in modern day Azerbaijan. However, the same scholars say that it's not clear that basically there was something called Albanian, and this language which is used in this manuscripts is a language that everybody in Albania spoke or whatever. So there is still a lot of uncertainty on this issue. Basically, but Old Udi, the language of this manuscripts, is a North Caucasian language, so it is more related to Georgian and even more so to the languages of the Caucasus rather than, let's say, to Armenian or Turkish, who are languages in other linguistic families. A separate kingdom in Albania is mentioned in the 1st century BCE, etc. Then, of course, at some stage, just like Armenia, a branch of the Arsacid, or in the Armenian case, Arshakuni family, also came to rule Albania as well. And that was the case roughly in the 4th century, when we have Armenian sources, giving us detailed information about the history of Armenia and its neighbors around that time. Again, according to medieval Armenian sources that have reached us, St. Gregory the Illuminator sent his grandson named Grigoris in order to proselytize among the Albanians in the 4th century CE. During his mission, he was actually killed by people who refused to accept him, and a few centuries later, or a few decades later, his relics were recovered and interred in Amaras, which I said is probably the oldest surviving church on the territory of Nagorno-Karabagh. And this is a map of Armenia. You see it in yellow. And the orange to the northeast of Armenia is Albania. Both of them were independent kingdoms, but they were very much under Sassanid Persian influence. In the year 387, the Byzantine Empire and the Persians divided Armenia between them. Moreover, the Persians detached the provinces of Artsakh and Udik from Armenia and annexed it to Albania. It didn't make much of a difference because ultimately both kings of Armenia and Albania were under Sassanid Persian suzerainty. It was during this period that Mesrop Mashtots created the Armenian alphabet. And again, according to Armenian tradition, one of the first schools that he established to spread the new alphabet and to teach it was in Amaras. Moreover, medieval Armenian sources say that Mashtots also created an alphabet for the Albanian language, and this is the script that was discovered, or the manuscripts that were discovered in this script are from this language. And what we knew, of course, helped the scholars to decipher that language and try to read it. Then in 428, the Sassanids abolished the Arshakuni kingdom in Western Armenia, but the kingdom of Albania survived, not only throughout the Persian period, but also in the early stages of Arab rule as well. It was basically abolished when the caliphs were ruling over the South Caucasus. In the meantime, in the year 552, a separate Catholicosate of AGHUANK basically emerged. and its jurisdiction also extended over the provinces of Artsakh and Udik, who were part of the expanded Albania at the time. After the 5th century, we have almost a century-long struggle in the East on the decisions of the Council of Chalcedon, and ultimately, during this long period of polemic, the Georgians seceded from the Armenian church and became Chalcedonians, while of course the Armenians and the Albanians remained pre-Chalcedonian, or what we used to call previously as non-Chalcedonian. It is taken usually for granted by almost everybody except some modern Azerbaijani scholars that the Catholicos of AGHUANK accepted the primacy of honor of the Catholicos of all Armenians. And they did have sometimes disagreements, but most of the disagreements were on administrative matters, and there is no reason to say that the Armenian church and the Albanian church as separate entities ever had serious doctrinal rivalries, something which modern day Azerbaijani historians are trying to argue to actually separate these two entities from one another. And when the line of kings in AGHUANK basically ran out and ended in the 8th century, the Catholicosate of AGHUANK continued. Very similar to the Armenian history, where the kings basically stopped being there, but of course the Catholicoi and the church continued. The headquarters of the Catholicosate of AGHUANK was initially in the town of Bardav. Later on, it changed locations a few times in the Middle Ages. And in the end, in the 14th century, it landed in the recently constructed, very famous monastery of Gandzasar, which of course still exists and is a functioning church. And in that sense, the Catholicosate of AGHUANK also started to be called the Catholicosate of Gandzasar. And as we will see, it continued until the 19th century. Its administrative boundaries, of course, change frequently. That is, the dioceses that actually were followers of the Catholicosate of AGHUANK changed because of the various administrative political changes that used to occur during those centuries. The Russians conquered Karabakh, as I said, in 1806. They recognized Etchmiadzin as the holy see of all Armenians under their jurisdiction, and therefore they considered the existence of a separate Catholicosate in Gandzasar superfluous in 1815, and they abolished it. The last Catholicos of Gandzasar was relegated to the rank of a metropolitan, who would see the two new dioceses that were established in the place of the Catholicosate of Gandzasar, the Diocese of Shemacha and the Diocese of Shushi. Shushi was a newly burgeoning town in the early 19th century. Then this metropolitan seat was further demoted in 1830 into an ordinary diocese of the Armenian Church, and it continued to function as a separate diocese up until the 1930s. By the turn of the 20th century, the jurisdiction of the Diocese of Shushi extended over approximately 225 villages, of which 215 had their own churches and also their separate kahanas, or married priests. And it is estimated that in the early 1900s, the total number of Armenian parishioners living within the bounds of the diocese was about 190,000. So the area it covered was much bigger than the 4,400 square kilometers of future Nagorno-Karabagh. Shushi, of course, was the headquarters of this diocese. It was a very thriving town with a mixed Armenian and Azerbaijani population, and both of them were very thriving communities in the second half of the 19th century. And the Armenians at that time built the very famous All Savior Church in the Ghazan-Chetsot district of Shushi, and that's why it's also sometimes known as the Ghazan-Chetsot Cathedral. It was built in the period between 1868 and 1887, and at that time it was the largest Armenian church in the world. Today it also remains one of the largest ever, although it has ceased functioning as an Armenian church since November of last year. After the Russian Empire collapsed, we know that there was a period of turmoil in the South Caucasus. Briefly, there were 3 independent republics, and then, of course, the Soviets came in and Bolshevized or Sovietized all those 3 republics: Azerbaijan and Armenia in 1920, and then Georgia in 1921. These republics, when they were independent, always had their territorial disputes, and Armenia and Azerbaijan contested the 3 regions of Nakhichevan, Zangezur, and or what we today call Syunik, and also Karabakh. And in the end, in 1921, the Bolshevik Party had to impose a compromise, and part of that compromise was the establishment of Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Region. However, during this period of political turmoil, there was a massacre in Shushi in March 1920, when the local Azerbaijanis basically were able to massacre their Armenian neighbors, and the city's Armenian quarters were destroyed. The Armenian prelate himself in Shushi was killed, and after that, Shushi has never recovered. In 1916, it had a population of 43,863, according to Russian records. It was one of the larger towns in the South Caucasus. By 1926, that population had dropped to 5,100, which means that not only the Armenians were massacred and fled, but a lot of Azerbaijanis also left the city because it stopped being a thriving center of economic activity. With the decline of Shushi, the neighboring small town of what's called Khankendi, and prior to that was called Varagan, was renamed Stepanakert after the very famous Armenian communist leader Stepan Shahomian, and it was made the capital of the new autonomous region. And since then, Stepanakert and Shushi, which are only a few miles apart from one another, have had very mixed fortunes. Stepanakert has grown and basically has replaced Shushi as the thriving center of the Nagorno-Karabakh region. In 1917, Khankendi had a population of 1,300 when Shushi had 43,000. By 1926, Stepanakert had a population of over 3,000, while Shushi had fallen to 5,000. But we see there, while Shushi was a very much mixed town, maybe the Armenians were about 55%, the Azerbaijanis were about 45%. Now these two cities have become relatively mono-ethnic. 85% of the population of Stepanakert was Armenian, 82% of the population of Shushi was Azerbaijani. This imbalance continued. By 1959, we've seen Stepanakert having close to 20,000 people, Shushi only 6,000. By 1989, the last year the Soviets held a census, Stepanakert had a population of 48,000, while Shushi only 16,000. Prior to the war as well, in 1920, Shushi had a population of about 5,000 to 6,000 people, and Stepanakert had something roughly about 50,000 as well. We don't know what demographic changes will be made now that Azerbaijan is paying particular attention to giving some kind of a new and very Azerbaijani image of Shushi after getting control of the city during the recent war. Now, coming back to the church, of course, like every place else in the USSR, the Armenian church in Karabakh was also persecuted by the Bolshevik authorities. And political police, the famous Cheka, the predecessor of the current KGB, village authorities, local communists confiscated church buildings, burnaments, turned the church buildings into theaters, clubs, workshops, warehouses, etc. They put a lot of pressure on the clergy by mocking them on the street, putting them under special high taxes, depriving them of having their share of the land when land was distributed among farmers in the villages. They forced many priests to renounce their calling and publish such statements in the newspapers that they were doing so. They also prevented diocesan bodies in Artsakh from pursuing their regular functions and tried to break their ties with Holy Echmiadzin. This is something, of course, they did in other parts of the Soviet Union as well, including in Soviet Armenia, when they tried to destroy the organizational structure of the Armenian church, at least until the late 1930s. Around the time of Sovietization, On the 4,400 square kilometers of Nagorno-Karabakh, there were 162 Armenian villages, of which 136 had churches built in the pre-Soviet period. Of these, by 1929, only 27 continued to function. And by the 1930s, almost not a single church was functioning any longer because of this continuous persecution of religion in Nagorno-Karabakh and of course in other parts of the USSR as well. For example, the St. George Church of Stepanakert in the late 19th century was expropriated and turned into storage. The church building was destroyed, and later on in its place, they built the Stepanakert Drama Theater. The number of serving Armenian married priests declined considerably, and it was very difficult for the diocesan structures to continue functioning. As I said before, in 1920, the prelate had been killed. It was only in 1922 that HBAZIN appointed a new prelate. He was a 70-year-old Archbishop, Anania Hamazaspian, and he served for less than 2 years. But then HBAZIN, of course Catholicos Kevork V, appointed a new Archpriest VRTANES HAKOBIAN, and he ended up being the last prelate of Karabakh. In the 1930s. During his tenure, of course, he was elevated to becoming a bishop. He established his seat at the monastery of Gandzasar because the diocesan headquarters in SHUSHI had been destroyed and the city had become a largely Azerbaijani town. In 1930, the Soviets arrested him. They kept him in jail for about 2 years. Then they released him. He went to ADMINISTRATIVE-TERRITORIAL. He participated in the elections of the next Catholicos, which occurred in 1932, as representing the Diocese of Artsakh as its clergyman delegate, but he would never be allowed back to Nagorno-Karabakh. And basically, there were no longer any prelates in Karabakh up until the year 1989. The Catholicos tried to send him abroad in order to head one of the dioceses of the Armenian Church outside the USSR, but he failed, and Bishop VRTANES died of natural causes in Echmiadzin in 1943. And as far as I know, he is buried in the compound of the Gayane Church next to the Holy Cathedral of Echmiadzin. So basically, by 1932, there was no diocesan structure in Karabakh, no functioning Armenian churches, and no practicing priests. In 1941, when the National Assembly was convened to elect the Catholicos, it did not elect one, but nevertheless, in the report that was presented to the Assembly, it was stated that the former Diocese of Artsakh and also Diocese of Gandzag, which is nearby, had been joined to the Diocese of Baku and Turkestan, which practically means that there were no longer churches there, and probably the only functioning churches were in Baku and in a few other areas. Of course, we believe that there was also a persecution of the Muslim religion, Islamic religion in Nagorno-Karabakh, but Armenian historians, since the end of the Soviet period, have not focused attention on this issue as well. So by using Armenian sources only, we cannot make a kind of a comparative perspective. I looked into more English language material on what exists about Azerbaijan, and there's not much there as well. And unfortunately, I cannot say that I've seen everything that is published in the Azerbaijani language in Baku, which perhaps has answers to this question. But in any case, there's a Soviet document which says from 1936 that there were 161 places of worship which had existed in Nagorno-Karabakh before Sovietization. All had been closed. This 161 places means that these were more than the Christian places, so probably they included both Christian and Muslim places of worship. But because the number of Muslims was much smaller, we assume that the number of Muslim places of worship were correspondingly also fewer than those of the Christian places. Now, what did the Armenian do, and how did Armenian Christianity survive in Karabakh without any formal structure? I've been looking for studies on this, and the only one that I know was published in England by Hrac Chilingirian. It's part of his doctoral dissertation. And Hrac conducted research fieldwork in Karabakh in the early 1990s. And he gives some idea about how people in the early 1990s remembered the practice practicing of religion in the Soviet period. I've been looking for studies done in Armenian. I'm still continuing, but so far I haven't come across anything. But of course, I still think that there is room for me to search, and probably I will find something that have been published and I have missed them. According to Ratchilingirian, in the absence of the Armenian church as an institution, and this, of course, continued for something like 60 years, with no functioning churches and no active priests, the need of Armenian Christians to believe in something was partially fulfilled by the communist ideology and by Armenian national, mostly lay and political aspirations on the other. Chilingirian says that rural and agrarian societies on the periphery of the USSR, such as the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabagh, embraced communist ideas with less skepticism than the urban industrialized counterparts in the center. They hoped that communism would eventually usher in a better future for their society. At least this is what he was told in the mid-1990s, after the communism system had disappeared. And he thinks that religious beliefs were gradually reduced to the private sphere of individual life. Family members learned Armenian Christian traditions by observing their elders. Traditional religious rituals continued to be practiced in secret, at times with amendments and adjustments within the nuclear family. However, within 2 generations, rituals related particularly to birth, marriage, and death lost their religious significance and retained only cultural significance. Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh continue to conduct local pilgrimages to what they consider to be holy places, and they were usually associated with saints and local legends and miracles, local khachkars, etc. So to some extent, in the eyes of communism, these would be seen as some kind of superstition in that sense. But of course, that kind of popular religion did survive, as it did survive in Armenia as well, of course, at the same period. Now I will come back to my own research. And as I said, my research is more based on the institution of the Armenian Church. And I will say that after 1940, slightly the Soviet policies towards the churches in general changed. Instead of trying to destroy the religion completely, the new Soviet policy was actually to co-opt religion and keep it under its own control. So limited revival under the watchful eye of the secret police was permitted throughout the USSR, and for particularly more reliable churches like the Russian Orthodox Church, the Armenian Church, the Georgian Church, etc., churches that did not have strong bonds with other church centers outside the Soviet borders, and these were, of course, were given particular attention. And of course, in the case of the Armenian Church, using the church as an instrument to influence the Armenian diaspora was also taken into consideration. We know that after the Second World War, there was a time of optimism among the Armenians, especially when the Soviet government in 1945 demanded the annexation of the region of Kars and Ardahan from Turkey. We now know, and these things were, of course, were kept secret at the time, that on 3 occasions in 1945, 1947, and 1949, the then leader of the Communist Party of Armenia, a person called Grigor Harutyunyan, whom we see in this picture, 3 times wrote to Stalin saying that it's better for Nagorno-Karabakh to be part of Soviet Armenia. To some extent, the argument was made that this will make room for the new repatriates that had moved to Soviet Armenia after 1945 as well. Some 90,000 people. I will not go into the details because the church here was not actually involved in this and probably did not even know about what was going on behind closed doors in Communist Party circles. However, at the same time, we see Catholicos Kevork, who was elected as the head of the Armenian Church in 1945, doing his own bit in order to resurrect Christianity in Nagorno-Karabakh. Between 1946 and 1954, we see him on and off conducting negotiations with bodies dealing with church affairs in the Soviet Union, trying to reestablish the diocese that proved impossible, or at least opening a church. And he proposed opening the monastery of Amaras, or at least a church in Stepanakert. But as far as we know, during his own lifetime, and he died in 1954, he was not able to reach any successful conclusion to this. We know that in 1947, actually very late in 1947, he actually took the initiative to appoint an archpriest and send him to to Amaras. But actually, when he reached Nagorno-Karabakh, the local authorities said that they did not have instructions to permit him to function, and so basically he had to return. And this attempt to actually have some kind of a fact presented to Soviet authorities by Catholicos Kevork did not succeed. Then, of course, comes the long Catholicosate of VAZGENT, who, of course, was head of the Armenian church for something like 40 years. The first few years of his reign coincided with the period of Nikita Khrushchev gradually de-Stalinizing the Soviet Union. So it was a period of relative openness. And in this period, there was an re-intensification of links between the Soviet Armenian Republic and the Nagorno-Karabakh autonomous region in Soviet Azerbaijan. And Vazgen I also played his own role in this growing relationship at that period. We know, for example, he helped the Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh obtain 50 Armenian language typewriters. Well, that was, of course, the technology then, because that would help in using Armenian language in, bureaucratic paperwork, and to some extent help maintain the Armenian identity of Karabakh at the time. Of course, he did this very much secretly, but of course, privately, he told some people what he was doing, and we know about these things from various memoirs. The Soviets actually, of course, and nobody will be surprised with this, were spying on Vazgen, and their spies actually reported that Vazgen himself did have some kind of sympathy towards what we call Armenian irredentism, or what the Armenians now call Bahanchadirutun, and he had told people around him that the Soviet decision in the 1920s to allocate Nakhichevan, Karabakh, and Akhalkalak, or what we now call Javakh, to Azerbaijan and Georgia was wrong. But in any case, he even went further than this and attempted to make a difference. In between February to May 1956, Vazgen was the first head of the Armenian church in the Soviet period, allowed to travel abroad and visit his flock in a number of Middle Eastern and European countries. This was the first of his many trips that he would conduct abroad, of course, during his 40-year reign as Catholicos. Prior to moving abroad, and Lebanon was going to be his first stop, as far as I know, France ended up being the last stop. He expressed willingness to meet with the Soviet Prime Minister Nikolai Bulganin. This was not a first, because his predecessor Kevork VI had met Joseph Stalin in 1945, and essentially Bulganin agreed to meet Vazgen, and basically this was the way that the Soviet government was going to make some concessions to the Armenian church. So basically, before traveling abroad, Vazgen submitted a draft letter to the Soviet Armenian authorities in Yerevan, who studied it, edited it, and in the end, when Vazgen returned from his trip in May 1956, so he was outside from February to May, quite a long period, he met Bulgarin in Moscow before actually flying back to Yerevan and Etchmiadzin. And during this meeting, he handed Bulganin 2 letters. The first one was the letter that was studied and it was approved. And so basically it was more like a formality. Bulganin accepted all the demands that had been, of course, screened and vetted at the lower levels of the Communist Party hierarchy. But the second one was a totally individual effort, which was a letter where Vazgen asked Bulganin for Karabakh, Nakhichevan, and Akhalkalaki to be returned to Armenia. Bulganin did not say no immediately, but after a few weeks, basically, Communist Party leaders told him that he had to forget that issue, and that was outside his own jurisdiction. However, Vazgen, for a certain period, seems to have been quite optimistic. Now, reading between the lines about his public pronouncements, we see a number of instances where he actually expresses hope that things will get better. And he was expecting at least a few places of worship to be opened in Nagorno-Karabakh, as well as in other parts of Azerbaijan and Georgia. In 1956, the locum tenens of the Diocese of Azerbaijan and Turkestan, that is from Baku, paid a pastoral visit to Ganzak and Karabakh. There was one functioning church in Ganzak, no churches and only one church in Karabakh was open at the time, and basically it was in the city of MARTAKERT. He also visited the monasteries of AMARAS and Ganzasar, which were of course closed at the time. We don't know when exactly this church in MARTAKERT was opened, and we assume it was closed in 1964, but we have evidence in the mid-1950s that church services used to be held regularly in MARTAKERT. But it is almost totally forgotten, this. And outside of the diplomatic, archival records, I am yet to meet somebody who will tell me orally about what happened or remembering this happening, although my search in MARTAKERT is continuing for people who may remember this episode. In 1957, VAZGENT paid a pastoral visit to Azerbaijan, and he visited Baku, he visited Kirovabad, Ganzak, and he also spent a few days in Nagorno-Karabakh. He did not, however, go to the MARTAKERT church during his itinerary, which we think was open at that time. The local Communist Party leaders, Armenians, and the Azerbaijani authorities welcomed him politely, but when we visited Shushi, he was very badly affected by the derelict state in which he found those churches, but he found Ganzasar to be in relatively better shape. He again asked the Azerbaijanis to reopen some churches, and also asked, but of course he did not get any positive answer for them. He also asked the local authorities in Shushi to clean the Gaziantep Cathedral, to restore its doors and windows, at least to prevent animals from entering the sanctuary. That was the state in which he found the Armenian churches in. In 1958, he made an attempt to meet Khrushchev directly to raise these issues, but he was refused an audience with him. By this time, Khrushchev had become prime minister instead of Bulganin as well. At that time, and we know this from internal correspondence, Soviet Armenian functionaries said that the reason they were not able to open churches outside Soviet Armenia is that the local authorities in Georgia, in Russia, in Azerbaijan were not enthusiastic about reopening Armenian places of worship. So basically only two churches continue to function in Azerbaijan, one in Baku and the other one in Kirovabad. In the 1960s, there was a lot of activity in Armenia and in Karabakh in order to annex Karabakh to Armenia. A lot of petitions sent to Moscow, but there is no evidence that the Catholicos himself was involved in this. A few years ago, a large volume of documents from the period of Vazgen I up until the year 1965 were published in Yerevan, and I've used those documents a lot for my research. We don't have similar volumes from later years, but from other published sources, we see that it was more difficult after the year 1960 for Vazgen I to be involved in Karabakh issues. And yes, on this picture, you see Haydar Aliyev with a very, very young Ilham Aliyev. And Haydar Aliyev, of course, became the strongman of Azerbaijan in 1969, and his dynasty continues to rule Azerbaijan up until now. He actually was much stiffer in resisting Armenian efforts in Karabakh, and gradually was able to silence all those dissident movements who wanted the annexation of Karabakh to Soviet Armenia. We have on record Vazgen the first telling a visiting Armenian diasporan dignitary in 1977 that the Armenians should be very careful when raising the issue of Nagorno-Karabakh, because Azerbaijan was stronger than Armenia in the Soviet structure, and Azerbaijan had in Haydar Aliyev an intelligent and influential leader. This was, of course, a criticism implicitly of the leadership of Armenia at the time. And as late as 1987, only a few months before the eruption of the Karabakh movement, when Vazgen was making his last visit to the United States, at a news conference in Los Angeles, he actually downplayed what was being done in Karabakh about, annexing the region to Armenia as well. He had basically he was very, very careful, probably having come to the conclusion that it will be something very, very difficult, and he did not himself want to get involved. And the only thing that he could do in those years was in 1980s, with the help of the Soviet Armenian government, they finally obtained permission to slightly renovate the Gaziantep Cathedral, which of course remained closed, but at least experts from Armenia went to Shushi in order to try to renovate the cathedral. And the work began in 1981 and continued until it was interrupted by the Karabakh conflict in 1988, when Armenians had to flee Shushi at the very beginning of the conflict. More dangerously on the long term, starting from the 1960s, the Azerbaijanis started developing this theory that they were the descendants of the Albanians and started to describe everything that is Christian on Azerbaijani territory, including medieval Armenian churches like Amaras and Kanzasar as Albanian churches. The person who started this theory among historians is a person called Zia Bunyatov, a very influential Azerbaijani historian, but of course seen as a history falsifier by at least his Armenian critics. And this has its own continuation. And since then, of course, Azerbaijanis have been developing this Albanian theory in order to deny that there was anything Armenian in those areas. Every Christian thing that they come across, they describe it as Albanian. They want to say that the Armenians are latecomers to this region who forcibly Gregorianized, this is the word that they use, or Armenianized the Albanian culture. This kind of creating an antagonism, I think it's very difficult to sustain, because the historical material that we have, which is not much, by the way, does not give room to such a kind of clear-cut division, but we all understand the political motivations behind it. By claiming that these churches are not Armenian, they start arguing that those people who are in Karabakh today are either Albanians who were forcibly Armenianized, therefore they are not Armenians, or at least they were latecomers who came to Karabakh in the 19th century after the Russian conquest of the region. Of course, it's a very tenuous kind of an argument, but I'm sure they'll be trying to develop this and try to create their own school of historiography in the coming years as well, because it really fits in their own vision of who they are and how they want the world to see them. And this is, for example, a very recent book where we have the monuments of Western Azerbaijan. By Western Azerbaijan, they understand the modern territory of Armenia. For them, as you see, even the Temple of Garni or the fortress of Ambert were Albanian structures, and according to them, there were no Armenians there at the time, etc. But in any case, I don't want to take this seriously, but at least in Azerbaijan, and to some extent in Turkey, it is popular. But also they are trying hard in order to push this into the agenda of European universities, and probably in American universities soon, we will have people who will try to argue the same case. Comes Gorbachev, and I want to finish here. And during his own time, of course, there was relative freedom of the Christianity, and within that, the Armenian government and the Echmiadzin together were able finally in 1989 to reopen the Armenian diocese, and in Gandzasar the first mass was held after a break of 60 years in 1989. That process was of course gradual about how Christianity penetrated slightly back to Karabakh. There was strong resistance from Azerbaijan, but on that occasion, the authorities in Moscow sided with Armenia and Echmiadzin. If need be, during the Q&A session, I can tell the story further. And since then, of course, for almost a period of 25 years. After the success of the First Karabakh War, the borders of Karabakh were expanded and the church gradually tried for some time. It was very difficult, but some old churches were renovated. Some basically were reopened. A few new churches were built in the past 25 years. But in the war since then, a number of these churches have now fallen under Azerbaijani control, and at least one we know which was built in 2017 has been fully destroyed. It has been documented by the BBC. Other churches have the problem of being Albanized, in the sense that Azerbaijanis are pushing their Udi community to claim them, and they are supporting them. And other churches have been vandalized as well. So that's a very difficult period for the Armenian church in the areas of Nagorno-Karabakh and the neighboring regions, which are no longer under Armenian control. And that's one of the big challenges that the Armenian church is facing now in Karabakh. I want to stop here, and I'm open for any kind of questions on what I said and on the issues that I did not tackle the later period in the rest of this evening for the Q&A session.
Thank you, Dr. Sanjian, for the presentation. So I will ask our guests to please ask questions in the chat area of our Zoom meeting. So if you have questions for Dr. Sanjian regarding his presentation or about anything that he didn't quite get to, that's okay. Please go ahead and write some questions, and then we'll go with those questions in that part of the discussion. Now, in the meanwhile, Dr. Sanjian, I'll just ask a couple of questions or a couple of comments, especially since 1991, 92, when Karabakh became independent. Then the Armenian Church really did begin to open a lot of churches in the diocese, especially with Bishop Barkev, right, Martirosyan. So, can you give us an idea of how many churches were open in that period, or roughly in that period?
I don't have I'm going to be a very cautious number because I'm trying to work with, I've avoided actually getting in touch with the clergy in Karabakh because of the recent, turmoil period that I'm sure before the publication of this work, I will check that all. But I believe it was, and I may be wrong here, but I believe we were talking about 17 functioning churches, of which 2 or 3 were totally newly built churches, one in Berzor, 2 in Stepanakert that were built from scratch, new. 1 in that Jebrail region, which of course was destroyed when the BBC discovered that. Some of you may have seen that report, etc. And others were, old established churches which were renovated in a way. It had been closed. And of course, AMARAS and Khanzas are the 2 more famous ones. AGHUANK was another one where regular church services were being held. Of course, in AGHUANK, they are still being held under very restricted conditions and some kind of Russian protection. AMARAS is in the border zone, so actually it's not fully functioning, but the Russians are taking the Armenians there. It's not under Azerbaijani control as AGHUANK is, but it's in the very close border region. I don't know what the future holds for that. Gandzasar is safe, of course. And so in that sense, the number of churches that were actually abandoned, and these of course mostly ancient medieval structures, is about 135, but maybe of those functioning that were abandoned were probably about a half a dozen. That's a rough estimate. The 135 number is the number from the Ministry of Karabakh, in a way that they said 13 monasteries and 122 churches, but most of these will be medieval structures.
Okay, if you have again questions, please write them in the chat area so that I can ask Dr. Sanjian your question. So go ahead and do that at this time. So I take it that you said that this is part of a larger project and a book project. Is that what your ultimate goal is on this, with just on the Armenian Church in Karabakh, or is it a broader topic than that?
No, it's a broader topic. And you remember, Barlo, I had just started that when I was in Fresno. So I've been working on and off in this. It's not my immediate work, but over these years, I have collected a lot of material. And at some stage, I will just put it in and start writing. But at least in the last few months, I published parts of that research. And the whole issue will be the whole history of the Karabakh region, from 1923 to 1987. With concentration on political developments, the church, and also activism in the Armenian diaspora. That's the way. But I may also now, I'm thinking of adding a fourth section, which is this issue of the whole Albanian conflict, which we call the paper wars that were going on between Armenian and Azerbaijani scholars about, these monuments, what they and the political significance of this polemic that was going on, which started roughly in 1965 and has been continuing ever since.
So we have a question for you. Excuse me. Can you speak a little about the history of the Armenian church during the period of the Melikdoms, during the period of the Melikdoms in Karabakh?
Well, basically it was part of the Ganzasar or the AGHUANK Catholicosate. And at that time, I think the very famous family which provided most of the Catholicoi was the Hassan Jalalian family. And some of them were quite active in diplomatic dealings with Russia and other, governments in the area. This is basically what I can say for that period. Azerbaijanis claim that the Hassan Jalalians were not Armenian, but I don't think there's any reason to accept what they're saying. I believe there were, yeah.
And I just want to ask again about sort of current events, just bringing it up to today. As a result of the September to November war in 2020, of course, many of the territories in Karabakh, the territories were taken back by Azerbaijan, which included Armenian monuments, including especially in Shushi, which you talk so much about. And there's been at least two documented incidents of complete destruction of Armenian churches. In Jibrail and in Ganatjam in Shushi, yes. And now Kazanchezotz is being quote unquote renovated, but really. So what do you see as what's happening here? Is this just a sort of a continuation of the policy of Azerbaijan, either to just minimize the Armenian presence in these areas by the destruction of the monuments of the churches?
This is nationalism in its worst aspects. And essentially, we have seen this kind of vicious things happening in the Balkans in the 1990s, and we're seeing the same thing. Azerbaijanis, it seems, want to create a brave new world in which Armenians not only exist in the present, but they also did not exist in their own past. And essentially what is being targeted is not only the Armenian church, everything that is Armenian is to some extent under danger. For example, monument to the Armenian genocide, which was in Shushi, was destroyed. Even more surprisingly, the monument to Ivan Tevosyan, who was a Soviet functionary during World War II, a junior minister in the Soviet war cabinet, who was very important on the economic side of the war. And so in that sense, he had nothing particularly Armenian in it. Basically, he was waging the war against Hitler, of which both Armenians and Azerbaijanis were part. So the reason why you bring down his monument in Shushi is simply because he was an Armenian from Shushi. So in that sense, that I gave the numbers on the churches, and I can give you about the number of khachkars and the others as provided by the government of Artsakh. But essentially, it's this idea to try to pretend that Armenians never existed in this region. They're actually wiping off, we know, Armenian inscriptions from the churches, saying that these inscriptions were later on added by the Armenians on what were Albanian, monuments, etc. That's their own version of the story. It can make sense, from Benedict Anderson's idea of growing nationalisms, etc. But essentially, what is being targeted is a culture that a neighboring people considers to be its own. Essentially, if there were no Armenians today, in the world. Azerbaijanis will say we are the descendants of the Armenians and cherish everything. But essentially, because there are Armenians today, they are actually destroying those monuments in order to create a past according to which they were the only people and their ancestors were the only people living in this area since times immemorial. So in that sense, from the viewpoint of nationalism, it can be explained. From the viewpoint of science and protecting culture, there's no way this can be understood or condoned or whatever. What is being done is barbarism.
And they're taking advantage of the relative weakness, let's say, of the Armenian government, probably, and then the relative inattention, or I don't know how we can explain it, but the international bodies that should be, monitoring or sending people are not doing so, or don't want to get involved. So it became a purely
or Barlow, they think it's too costly and it's not worth the effort.
Right.
Yeah.
Good. Okay. I think I don't see any more questions, but I want to thank you for a really fascinating look at this history. Oh, we have another question. So in regards to the fact that churches or monuments are getting destroyed, what can be done on the international level? Again, why the whole world is silent. If this was any other country, the world would have talked about it or to condemn it at least. So do you see that there's something special because it's happening to the Armenians, or is this just again purely pragmatic politics that's taking place?
No, I don't think it's something special just happening to the Armenians. I'm sure so many other cultures have their monuments destroyed, and we do not know about what's happening because the world doesn't focus attention on these issues in the same way as it does not focus attention on the Armenian plight now. And what the Armenians will raise their voices at the moment. There's no way Armenians can launch an attack on Azerbaijan in the coming months or year or two to get back those territories, because I don't think for the moment the Aliyev clan, which is ruling Azerbaijan, essentially, it's a clan there, is interested in actually mending bridges and come to a peaceful conclusion. They think probably the way we get the messages that showing this strength, etc., is more beneficial to them. And at the moment, for different reasons, President Putin, who promised that he will have these things under his attention, is not doing the minimum that Armenians expect him to do. But I'm choosing my words very carefully here because, as again, maybe if any foreign government will intervene, it will be too costly to intervene. What will you put Azerbaijan under international sanctions? How would you stop them? What is the cost for Europe or other things to do it? Certainly, they're not ready to go there yet.
And I would bring everyone's attention to several weeks ago, the Society for Armenian Studies and the Society for Syrian Studies held a joint panel on this very topic about, it's a worldwide problem. What happened in Syria during the Syrian civil war, many monuments were destroyed for political purposes. It was done in Afghanistan. It's been done in other areas of the world. So it is not just only the Armenians, but of course it is happening. And we do need to raise our voices for that. Thank you again, Dr. Sanjian. I want to express our appreciation for your presentation. Tonight's presentation will be archived on the Armenian Studies Program YouTube channel. And so if you'd like to go back to it or tell others about it, you can certainly find it on our Armenian Studies Program YouTube channel. So thank you all for joining us this evening. And we'll see you next semester with our new fall semester activities. Thank you and good evening.